everyone, I'm Ashley McManus, Director of Marketing at Affectiva. Welcome to Affectiva Asks, a human-centric AI podcast, where each episode we will interview a thought leader doing cutting-edge work in the AI space. A little bit about us. Affectiva is the pioneer of in-cabin sensing AI, software that can detect nuanced human emotions, complex cognitive states, behaviors, activities, and interactions within next-generation vehicles. Today's episode features Affectiva CEO Dr. Rana el Kaliouby interviewing Jennifer Haroon, Executive in Residence at Greylock Partners. Jennifer has an illustrious career in automotive. Most recently, she was COO and interim CFO at Nauto, and prior, the head of business operations for Waymo. This conversation was a result of Affectiva's recent collaboration with the organization Women in Autonomy to help drive change by highlighting the success of amazing women in automotive. While many women are rising through the ranks and doing incredible things in this industry, they are still underrepresented in the highest positions. So, we are hosting a new series of livestream events called Women at the Wheel, together with Women in Autonomy, where Rana will have a dynamic conversation with a female leader in automotive, exploring their unique journey, the challenges they've had to navigate, how they've sought out mentors and allies, and paths to leadership. Let's listen in to learn more.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to the inaugural series of Women at the Wheel, which is a new quarterly live stream in partnership with Women in Autonomy. In Autonomy is a nonprofit organization that is on a mission to bring more women and women leaders into the automotive industry. Before I dive into what the series is about, if you don't know me, I'm Rana el Kaliouby. I'm co-founder and CEO of Affectiva. We are an MIT spin-out on a mission to humanize technology. And one of our core areas of focus is in the automotive industry. We started really working in that space about 3.5 years ago now. And it struck me that there weren't a lot of women, in the spaces that I was in, be it kind of client meetings or investor meetings. And so I've become a huge advocate for supporting and finding more women in the auto tech and the automotive industry. So Women at the Wheel is a new series that's going to take a look inside the careers and the career journeys of leading women in the automotive space, exploring their current roles, their responsibilities. How did they really come into the automotive industry? What are some of the hurdles and challenges that they've had to overcome? How did they seek out mentors and allies and kind of come together as a community and talk about how we as women and women leaders can affect change in that industry? Finally, and most importantly, pay it forward. So the goal is to inspire other women in the industry and bring us together. So to kick off this series, it is my pleasure to introduce Jennifer Haroon, who is currently an executive in residence at Greylock Ventures. Prior to that, Jennifer was COO and CFO at Nauto, which Nauto and Affectiva kind of orbit in the same universe of driver monitoring, fleet, interior sensing. So our two companies have overlapped and come across each other over the last few years. But it's a real pleasure to have you, Jennifer. Welcome.
Rana, thank you so much. I want to say how honored I am to be the first guest for this amazing quarterly series that I'm really excited about. As you know, I'm on the steering committee for Women in Autonomy, so I think you and I share a lot of the same goals, and I'm so excited to be here, and have this conversation with you.
Before we dig into your background, actually, why don't you tell us a little bit more about Women in Autonomy, since you're on the steering committee, and how you became part of that?
Sure. Women in Autonomy was started by a wonderful group of women who, by the way, do this as their side gig. So I'm so impressed with them. They have regular full-time jobs in AV and AV-related companies. And really, the initial goal was very similar to what you discussed, which is to bring together women who were working in AV and AV-related companies, because it didn't feel like there were that many. Mm-hmm. And then it's evolved to include not just connecting them, but mentorship. So there's a mentorship and a peer mentorship program, which is really wonderful. There are speaker series and pre-COVID times events. And then obviously this wonderful partnership with Affectiva, I think just adds to the mission. So I'm really excited about this and all the things that Women in Autonomy is going to continue to do.
And thank you for, making time to be part of that organization and for being our inaugural speaker too.
Absolutely.
So, I didn't speaking out of my own experience, I didn't kind of grow up in the automotive industry. I'm a technologist by background. And it's only 3 years ago when we started exploring the automotive and the auto tech space that I kind of immersed myself into that universe. I think it's the same for you. So why don't you tell us your journey and how you ended up in the automotive industry?
Absolutely. I won't go all the way back. Otherwise, it'll take too long. But you're right. You and I really share this. And it was really, I was at Google. I was about 6 years into my Google journey. And I was working on the company that I helped start with other Googlers that was focused on, basically we built a B2B fiber optic network in sub-Saharan Africa, which is very far away from anything automotive. And at the time, like I said, it was about 6 years, I was thinking of leaving Google, not because I didn't enjoy my time at Google, but because I wanted to experience what I call a real startup, right? Starting a company inside a big company, totally different. And I was doing my rounds with the connections I had made inside of Google, just, to talk about my plans. And a woman that I had worked with, who was part of the finance team, a very senior woman in the finance team, said, well, before you go, can you just go talk to this one team? I think you can, the skills that you've developed, and there's some overlap, just meet with them. And that ended up being the Google self-driving car project, which is now called Waymo. And I decided to join essentially because oddly enough, there was a lot of overlap, right? At the time, they were mainly an R&D project, really starting to think about commercialization and partnerships. And so I could play what I felt like was a big role in developing those early ideas. And that's exactly what I did. And that's how I ended up in automotive.
Fascinating. You've actually now made the jump from, Waymo and then Nauto to kind of joining Greylock as an executive in residence. So can you tell us more about your role there and what are you trying to accomplish?
Sure. The executive in residence role is not very it's not a very structured role, which is really nice, and it's not meant to be permanent. I definitely am excited to go back to operating eventually, but it's a nice way for me both to give back to Greylock, which is a Nauto investor, as well as learn new things. So I'm primarily spending my time on two things. One is helping portfolio companies that are interested in my help in areas where I have expertise. And sometimes that's as simple as one phone call with the CEO, maybe to discuss, executive hiring or, a specific topic that I have experience in. And then the other way is a more regular engagement, maybe to help with go-to-market strategy or some other operational issue. So that's one part. And then the second is looking at investments with some of the investing partners. I'm not making investing decisions, but it's really nice for me to see how early stage investing decisions are made because it's an area I'm personally interested in.
And it sounds like you are maybe partially focused on the mobility space, but not entirely. Can you comment on that?
That's right. Greylock has a wide variety of investments, some of them in the mobility and transportation space, companies like Convoy, Aurora, Neuro, in addition to Nauto, but many, many others, both in consumer and enterprise. So one of the other areas that I, in particular, are interested in is what you might call productivity apps. I think of it as something that a COO or CFO might think about buying to help make the non-technical side of the house more efficient, more productive, easier to understand.
That would be certainly of great help to a lot of people.
I think there's a lot of opportunity there as well.
So can you comment on what again, you've been in the industry or the auto tech space for a number of years now. Can you comment on the evolution of the trends in that space? Like, what are you seeing? What do you feel has stuck over the last few years? What are trends that we should be excited about?
Yeah, well, I think you're probably very familiar with the acronym CASE. And I don't remember exactly when it was developed, but I think probably less than a decade ago. And for those who don't know, CASE stands for connectivity, autonomy, shared, and electrification. And I won't go through all of them because, I don't want to take up too much time, but we can dig into any of them. But I think a couple of interesting trends, right? Electrification. I mean, we can't deny that has been a huge trend in recent years. And the role that Tesla has really played in advancing EVs. And now we're seeing a number of EV companies, as well as traditional automakers, finally really developing electric vehicles. And then also regulations, particularly in Europe, to support EVs and the sale of EVs. So I think that's been a huge trend over the last couple of years that we can dig into a little more. And then the other one that we both, I can't not talk about autonomy, given this partially sponsored by Women in Autonomy, but it's also been a very exciting space. And I think it's really gone through that whole hype cycle, right? Around the time that I left the Google self-driving car project, that it was then, called Waymo, there were a whole bunch of startups that started in this space, which I think is a great sign that the technology and the things needed, like big data, computer vision, advances,
right?
AI, exactly, that very well, we're starting to come together. That being said, what we're starting to see is the consolidation that I do think is really necessary. Given the time, money, talent needed to develop autonomous vehicles, I think we're going to continue to see that consolidation. And just yesterday, Cruise announced that they were buying Voyage. And so I think that will continue. Yeah.
Very cool.
Both great teams. So I think that's really exciting.
That is awesome. And then we can't talk about the, mobility trends without touching on SPACs.
And indeed.
So what are you seeing in kind of from where you sit, and what do you think of all of that?
Well, it's interesting. I have to admit that when the SPACs sort of late last year just seemed to be coming out of the woodwork, even though they aren't actually a new tool, I was a bit doubtful at first. And
Jennifer, it occurs to me that a lot of our listeners may not be familiar with what a SPAC is. Can you kind of simplify it and summarize it?
Yes. So a SPAC is essentially SPAC sponsors, which are sort of like investors, come together. They front some money, and the SPAC itself, which is basically I don't want to call it a shell company, although it's kind of like a shell company because it's not a company that's developed to do anything other than find a company to merge with. The SPAC company itself IPOs. Mm-hmm. So in addition to the sponsors putting in money, folks can buy shares in it and on the public markets. And then they usually have about 2 years to find another company. And then the SPAC and that company merge such that the target company then becomes a public company. That's sort of my very simplified
that's an awesome explanation. And for the last year or so, we've seen a lot of mobility companies go public essentially via SPACs.
Exactly. And so I was saying, at first I was very doubtful because I really worried that some of these companies, particularly on the EV side, weren't ready to be public companies, right? Being a public company has a lot of requirements. There's a lot of regulatory requirements. So that takes away executive and other focus from the development that needs to happen. And I also worried, given the long timeline of EV companies, AV companies, and even some of, the self-driving, self-flying car companies, right?
Oh, right.
that the public investors wouldn't have the patience for that kind of company, right? A lot of them are pre-revenue.
Right.
And there's a lot of development, right? A lot of LiDAR companies went public through a SPAC. And my viewpoint has changed a little bit. A couple of things. One is I do think there's a lot of interest in the public in getting involved and participating in the venture, what traditionally has been the venture market.
Right.
And, there's this whole trend of democratizing investing.
Right.
And as with every trend, there's good and bad to that. But I do appreciate that this gives the opportunity for others that really welcome that vision and have the patience for a longer term investment to participate. And of course, when you participate earlier, that payoff can be larger. It is also riskier though. So I think, investors have to see both those.
Yeah. And I think it comes hand in hand with a lot more needs for educating, right? Educating the public around how to evaluate these types of companies, which is very different than how you would evaluate a typical public company, maybe.
That's right. On the company side, one of the benefits is when you go public through a SPAC, you raise quite a bit of money all at once. Right? And that also comes with pros and cons. We talked about these companies still needing quite a bit of development, and that often can be hard for traditional venture investing, right? Venture investors don't always invest in a lot of hardware companies,
and
software companies, right? Popular, and those longer timelines. So these companies are able to raise quite a bit of money all at once, and then it becomes a question of execution and using that money well.
It's so fascinating. It struck me as how kind of in your career you kind of were open to embarking on a journey without really knowing where it's going to take you to, right? And so can you share maybe some advice or guidelines? How do you make those decisions? When do you say, intriguing, I'm going to kind of go down that path, or maybe not?
It's actually something I struggled with in the earlier parts of my career. And then now, at first, it wasn't part of advice that I wanted to give because it seemed a little bit counterintuitive. I think often you'll read or hear advice that is, plan things out, right? You need to set a goal and then go after it. And oftentimes the most efficient way to go after it is a very straight line career. And I'm not saying that's bad advice, by the way. But for me, I found that I would often set goals and then I would see something else that just intellectually interested me. I really love new challenges. And I tend to be pretty open-minded to that sort of thing. And you could call that a distraction, right? Moving off the path. But for me, I've found that it's been advantageous to take advantage of those opportunities, not all of them. And so it's a combination of sort of having a path, but being open-minded and flexible enough to look at these other opportunities and say, well, it's a bit off the path, but here are the benefits that I think I can get and also bring. So that, being open-minded is the advice that I most consistently give now, because, it's really worked for me. And I think sometimes when you just do a completely straight line path, you can, have blinders on, right? And I think as an entrepreneur, that sometimes you've got to be really focused and have those blinders on, but you also have to be at least recognize the other opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. It's something that we run into at Affectiva all the time. Obviously, you do need to be focused on a strategy. But I always like to say it's so important to have your antennas up and kind of be plugged into what else is happening in the industry, because sometimes you don't know where these really interesting opportunities come from. But it's definitely something my team at Affectiva know this all the time. It's definitely something we struggle with a lot. I wonder if you ran into that at Nauto or maybe Waymo, where, there's a lot of different maybe use cases or directions you can take the company in. How do you evaluate where to focus your energies?
Yeah, it's definitely both a personal issue and also for companies and certainly for startups, right? The most common refrain you hear for startups is focus, and I do agree with that. But I think you're right that you have to have your antennas up and not your blinders on, because if you miss trends in the industry you're in, you can get stuck, right? You can get stuck going down the right path.
Totally.
It's hard to give advice on this, obviously, because I have lived it, and it's hard to make very clear yes and no decisions, especially when it feels like there are so many wonderful opportunities, right? You feel like as a company, you're so lucky to have all these incoming opportunities. I mean, it feels so much better than if you were if you were a startup and there were no opportunities, right? It feels really good. And I think it goes back to having clear goals, right? Clear goals and a mission as a company, and being very clear about those. And yes, having the discussion, but also having some conviction over what you're doing. Sometimes those opportunities are actually, they really are just distractions.
Right.
And, and a startup just doesn't have the money, the people, the time to do everything. And you really do need to reach your core goal to make the company successful.
Right. Absolutely. This is great advice. So switching gears a little bit, what has your experience been as a woman in the automotive space? And what do you think has been one of the biggest hurdles for you as a female leader to advance your career in automotive?
Yeah, it is interesting. I've worked, I didn't cover my early career, but I started my career in the investment banking field, which, is notoriously, has notoriously had issues in the past and continues to struggle in terms of gender equality. And, when I started working for the self-driving car team, one of the things I worked on was partnerships with automotive companies and the field more broadly. And I noticed that every single person, save one company, everyone sitting on the other side of the table from me was a man.
Yeah.
And usually also much older than I was. And also usually, I'm generalizing a little bit here, spent decades in the automotive field, right? And here I was, younger, a woman, and new to the automotive industry. And, I didn't feel any overt discrimination or gender bias, but it was very noticeable. And it made me wonder, is this the automotive industry? Is this what the whole industry is like? Or is it just happens to be the people and the level of people that I was encountering? And so I don't know. It's hard to say if it was a hurdle, right? But it was definitely something that I noticed. And I also had a team at the time of quite a few women. And so
you did. Oh, that's actually pretty awesome. Huh.
Yeah, my lead BD person who is now at another AV company and doing amazing was also a woman. And so, it is something that we really noticed. And I will say that one time, I know there was an overt comment. So I was visiting a company, I won't name the company, and lucky enough to test drive one of their vehicles. And I was with some of the engineers who were male. And as I got into the car, one of my engineers later told me, the automotive engineer I was talking to said, I never thought I would see the day that a woman would be driving Bleep. Like I said, I won't name Bleep.
Oh my God.
It was a high performance sports vehicle. So.
Okay. Oh, interesting. Okay.
And so, I like to think that I helped break some barriers and misconceptions about women in automotive, even through, I was the one that asked to test drive that high performance sports vehicle, not the engineers on my team. I was really excited about it. So yeah, I don't know if that answers the question, but this is one of the reasons why I really support women in autonomy. I do want to see more women in this industry. I do believe that diversity leads to better decisions, better returns, all the things.
One of the things that I think is very powerful about women in autonomy as an organization is I feel strongly that we need to showcase role models, right? Because if we can showcase an example like you, and I don't know who's tuned into this, but they see you as a potential, like, oh, this is the journey she's taken. Maybe I can do that too, right? I think that there's a ton of power in that.
I think when you're in the place where you have a lot of role models, I think in some ways, and not because you're ill-meaning, you take for granted the power that role models have and role modeling has. And the, yes, I see a person that I have some sort of connection with, and it makes me feel like I can do that too. Totally. And I also think that, there's this old trope that women don't help other women. And perhaps, there was a time that was the case. I think we very thankfully live in a time where I don't think that's the case at all. And so I also think that's really important, is that there are women in these positions that where they can help other women try to get there. And I think that's also really important, because that's how it's always worked for, the more traditional men, frankly.
Right. Right. You're part of a network. You're able to tap in for opportunities and support, which brings me to our next topic. What is the role of mentorship and also allies? And actually yesterday I was in a conversation where the topic of sponsorship came up too. It's not just a mentor, but maybe a sponsor, somebody who advocates for you, brings you opportunities. So can you comment on all of that?
Absolutely. I have personally always struggled with the idea of mentorship, right? You're told all the time, get a mentor. And it's sort of like, how? How am I supposed to just, how does this work? Right? I know that some companies, you get sort of assigned a mentor or a buddy, but in reality, it doesn't have to be someone from your company, right? And so instead, a couple of thoughts. One is, and I think you talked about this recently, is the importance of networking. Right. And that's another thing that I continue to struggle with, how, and it was brought up last night on Good Times show on Clubhouse. There was a pretty heated discussion about networking, because it's a question of how much time do you spend on your job, right? And doing an excellent job, because then you'll be noticed. That's sort of the idea. And on networking, which is oftentimes external to your job. And that's a tough balance, right? Especially if you're at a startup, you're working a lot. How much time do you dedicate to networking? And I would say, I feel like early in my career, I didn't dedicate enough time to networking. And that could be, watching events like this, right? And engaging. It could, and once we get back to the after times, in-person events, it could be as easy as checking in with people you've worked for or worked with, right? I often have particularly women who have previously worked for me contact me when they're trying to make a career decision. And I love that. I love that I'm able to be there for them and help them think through the next stage of their career. So that's my comment on mentoring. I think it doesn't have to be a single person. It doesn't have to be, we meet weekly or bi-weekly, right? It doesn't have to be so structured, but it does take effort and it does take time. And you have to find that right balance. On sponsorship, I love that term because I think it's so true. And I feel like I've been very blessed in my career to have people that in some ways have been sponsors, right? So even the woman that I described, who was still is a very senior woman in the Google finance team, who said, well, let me introduce you to this team first. There's nothing wrong with your plans, but think about this. That's a form of sponsorship, right? She thought enough about me to recommend me to this team, and she thought enough about that team, to think that it was a good opportunity for me. And so I do think sponsorship is important, and it's really up to the women and men in positions of power, whatever power that is, to look for opportunities to sponsor someone else in their careers.
Yeah, and I feel like we don't talk enough about this idea of sponsorship. So it got put on my radar yesterday, and I was like, absolutely, that makes total sense, and it's quite different than mentorship.
It is.
Adam Grant talks about this idea of a personal board of directors, of our advisors, right? That can, you don't have to meet with them on a weekly basis or a monthly basis, but they're there, and you can tap into them for advice, for cheerleading. I think that's an important role too. So it resonates with me a lot. This, your experience of earlier in your career not investing in your network. For me, success meant hunkering down.
That's right.
Work, and all of that. In my mind, felt like a distraction. In retrospect, investing in your network is an amazing way to advance both your role, but also kind of, your career opportunities.
Well, I think the other challenge is networking and engaging with mentors or your personal board. It takes time, and it's time outside of your day job. Right. And so just like you, I was always very hunkered down. I wanted to do very well in my job. And I think this was the debate that was happening last night. And I still think that's important, right? You need to show that you are good at the role that you're in. And it can be tired. At the end of the day, your work day, you're tired and you're like, do I really want to go network? I mean, I'm an introvert. So then it's also like, am I even going to seem like an engaging, interesting person? I'm so exhausted. Exactly. And so I do think it's important to invest some time in that. But we all should recognize that it's difficult. It's very easy to say, and I find it much more challenging to do.
Absolutely. And actually, if you have a family, if you have young kids or responsibilities at home, I think that makes it especially hard and probably unequally harder for women too.
Yes, absolutely.
Especially for women who are earlier in their careers in the automotive industry, and they kind of are put into these situations where they're maybe the only woman voice around the table. They have these engineers who are like, oh, I never thought I'd live to see a day where a woman, what's your advice for these, younger women in their careers?
Yeah, a woman who worked for me just last week, I caught up with her and she had a similar question. And I think it's very situational and it needs to be personal. So I don't like to give super generalized advice because it's not true for every situation. So what I mean by that is, for me personally, I don't like to be super confrontational all the time. I just don't always feel like that you get to the right end result. In this case, if the engineer had made that comment to me, I might have said something kind of a little bit more jokingly around, a little more playful around, I'm glad I could, show you the different, something different, or actually a lot of women buy cars, including very expensive cars, right? There's maybe you should learn a little bit more about your consumers. And so, rather than be very direct and say, oh, that was a horribly sexist thing to say. And that was partly because I was also there to build a relationship with that company for my company, right? But also because I don't always think the most confrontational way is actually how to get your point across. But there are times where certainly women face real, sexual harassment that is totally inappropriate. And in those cases, I do think, then you need to take a much more direct and sometimes very forceful approach and get help. So it sort of depends on the situation. Yeah. But I've experienced a lot of those more subtle comments over
and probably kind of it's what's the word? Not intentional. It's like literally this guy just never thought he would, right?
Exactly.
It's some meaning, I guess. Yeah.
He was voicing his own experience, right? And so I wouldn't want to say, well, your experience is wrong.
Right. One thing that we've gotten into the habit of doing at Affectiva, so much so that I think it's become part of our culture, we've all become very attuned to when women around the table, if a female member around the table gets interrupted, like we'll literally stop the meeting and I'll say, oh, wait, Gabby, what did you have to say? I really want to hear your opinion on this. So I don't know if you have a similar experience or similar advice.
Absolutely. And I think, again, there's a mix of it's up to the women and men that are running the meeting or are more senior to do exactly what you described, is to recognize those interruptions and in some ways interrupt to fix the interruption or address it later. I think you can also address it privately, right, as feedback to the interrupter. And I've been in that situation and I've seen other women in that situation where they'll say, let me finish, right? I also think that's okay to interrupt back and say, I'm not done making my point or asking my question or whatever it is. So I think it's a combination of the sponsorship idea that we talked about, but also taking matters into your own hands. That's one where I think it's good to take matters into your own hands as well.
Mr. Vice President, I'm speaking.
Exactly. I think that was wonderful. It was a great example of that.
Totally. All right. So to wrap up, what do you think we can do to improve the representation of women in the automotive industry? And maybe what are some of the tangible examples for that?
Yeah. So, I mean, a couple of things. One is, I do think organizations like Women in Autonomy and getting involved in them is really important, because it's partly what we talked about, right? Seeing other women in those positions. I also think the mentorship program and the peer mentoring, so that you hear other women are going through the same things you are. They're experiencing the same challenges, whether it's specific to gender or just about your job, right? The challenges of your job and your role. So that's one thing. I also think, I'm really excited to see more women in senior positions. So I have to say, Mary Barra, GM, I mean,
amazing,
huge, right? It makes a huge difference to see a woman.
And the CEO of Zoox, I forget her name, the CEO of Zoox too. She's pretty awesome.
Yes, exactly. And so I know that's not something we all can necessarily do, influence who's going to be CEOs of companies. I would say, look at Rana. If you have an idea, don't be scared to do something about that, right? Absolutely, entrepreneurship isn't for everyone, but don't think about your gender as a reason why it's not. So those are a couple of comments that I have on that.
Thank you. It's been wonderful having this conversation. And again, everybody, this is the first of a series of Women at the Wheel, where we'll be having conversations supporting more women along their journeys in the automotive and the auto tech industry. And I want to thank Jennifer. Thank you so much for joining us today. And also Women in Autonomy for kicking off this series.
Thank you so much, Rana.
Probably my favorite takeaway from Rana and Jennifer's conversation was around having a path, but being open-minded and flexible enough to look at other opportunities and the supporting benefits you could get and bring to the table. Jennifer's career is a perfect example of this. So I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe to Affectiva's Human-Centric AI podcast on iTunes, Google Play, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts for new episodes. We are also on social media, so please reach out to us on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Instagram at Affectiva to share any feedback you have on the show and weigh in on the discussion using hashtag #AffectivaAsks. Don't forget to rate us and comment with your feedback to help make the podcast more discoverable for others. Until next time, thanks for listening.